On the morning of May 6, 2025, a wildlife biologist retrieving a trail camera from a game trail above the Grey Wolf River inside Olympic National Park pulled a memory card holding 6 weeks of motion-triggered captures from a joint carnivore monitoring survey, the same style of program that has spent years running remote cameras across the Olympic Peninsula for martens, fishers, and other elusive carnivores. Most of the card is routine: black bears, a bobcat, Roosevelt elk moving through at dusk. Then, on April 30th, one frame shows a large canid crossing the trail at a steady trot, favoring its right hind leg with a hitch just pronounced enough to notice on a still image. Nothing else on the card that season shows anything close to it in size. What makes this particular frame worth pulling out of 6 weeks of ordinary data is a second photograph from a different station 22 kilometers south along the Dos Wallops drainage, time-stamped 17 days later. A large canid, same build, same steady trot, the same hitch in the same hind leg. Picture the trail at that hour, low clouds sitting in the canopy the way it does most mornings on this side of the range. The ground still soaked from overnight rain. No other tracks crossing the game trail for the length of the frame in either direction. This was not a domestic dog off-leash. Off-leash dogs on a monitored game trail inside a national park get flagged and cross-checked against ranger patrol logs, and no matching report exists for either date. It was not a wolf-dog hybrid of the kind occasionally reported loose in rural parts of the peninsula, either. Hybrids raised in captivity and later released typically show collar scarring, poor coat condition, or comfort with human scent on a trail. This animal shows none of that in either frame. And it was not simply a large coyote, the single most common explanation offered for any big canid on Pacific Northwest trail cameras. The detail that neither photograph explains away is the leg itself. Two different coyotes do not develop the identical gait fault in the identical leg. What these two frames show, read together, is one animal, injured the same way in both, covering 22 kilometers of mountainous drainage in just over 2 weeks, a range no resident coyote on this peninsula is known to hold. Where those two cameras sit matters as much as what they caught. Wolves are native to the Olympic Peninsula, and the documentary record of that is not thin. Clallam County's own auditor records list 69 separate wolf references between 1890 and 1975, sightings, individual reports, and bounty payments. 46 of those bounties were paid out in Clallam County alone between 1906 and 1929. According to Washington's own state wolf coordinator, the last 2 documented wolves on the peninsula were killed in 1920 near the Quinault River, on the opposite side of the range from where this camera sits. The peninsula's indigenous nations, the Clallam, the Makah, the Quinault, and others whose traditional territory the park now sits inside, have their own documented linguistic and cultural ties to wolves that predate any of this by centuries, a history this file treats as exactly that. History, not evidence, and not something this account is qualified to interpret, beyond acknowledging it exists. The name on the first camera's station log is not a coincidence added for effect. The Grey Wolf River has carried that name on maps of this range since before the species it's named for was gone from the drainage. Whoever named it wasn't naming a memory. At the time, the river had wolves in it. It would be easy to file this as a rural folktale a state agency doesn't need to take seriously. A coyote seen at dusk, retold into something bigger by the time it reaches a comment section. That explanation survives a casual sighting from a car window. It does not survive 2 synchronized field cameras on a monitored survey grid producing matched, time-stamped, injury-specific evidence 22 kilometers and 17 days apart. It also does not survive Washington's own wildlife agency, which has been publicly on record since well before this pair of photographs, saying it would not be surprised to see wolves back on this exact peninsula at some point in the coming years. and it would be easy to assume the imagery itself is unreliable. Cheap trail cameras, easily faked, easily mistaken for something they aren't. This survey doesn't run on cheap trail cameras, and it doesn't run on a single unverified upload. Every unit on this grid is logged, GPS tagged, and retrieved on a fixed schedule by biologists who cross-reference every unusual capture against Ranger Patrol records, livestock reports, and known captive hybrid releases before a single frame gets flagged for further review. A card doesn't leave the field without a chain of custody attached to it. Olympic National Park itself, established in 1938, covers 922,650 acres, close to 3,734 square kilometers, roughly the size of Rhode Island, with 95% of that land designated wilderness. It is also, because of the peninsula's history of glacial isolation, missing several species common just across the water on the mainland Cascades. No lynx, no wolverine, no grizzly bear, no native mountain goat before one was introduced in the 1920s. It is a landscape that has never fully matched its neighbors, which makes the question of who exactly still gets to live on it a genuinely open one. Understanding exactly who runs this camera grid and how matters before anything else about these two frames makes sense. The survey is staffed by wildlife biologists working in partnership with a regional zoo-based conservation program and the State Wildlife Agency, using the same citizen science camera network model that has documented wolverines, lynx, and the first wild wolf pups born in Washington in nearly a century, back in 2008. On a different part of the range. None of the people running stations on this particular grid came to it chasing a rumor. Several had already logged multiple seasons photographing martins and fishers on this same peninsula before either of these two frames existed, work that involves far more hair snares and bait stations than headline-worthy captures. And that builds exactly the kind of caution a program like this needs before it puts a name to something moving through a frame at dusk. The array itself is provisioned the way any long-running carnivore survey is provisioned. Motion-triggered units mounted at a consistent height along known game trails, synchronized to a shared clock, each station logged with GPS coordinates and a maintenance schedule that has every camera checked and its card pulled roughly every 6 weeks, whether or not anything unusual has turned up on a given rotation. Sites are chosen for game trail traffic and terrain access, not for any reputation the drainage might already carry, and each unit's housing is bolted and cable-locked to the same way, regardless of what species the station is nominally targeting that season. The card from the Gray Wolf River station before this pull had produced nothing but the expected roster of black bear, bobcat, and elk across 5 previous rotations. That was this particular station's last ordinary season, indistinguishable from the 4 before it, filed and archived without a second look from anyone on the team. The connection wasn't made in the field. It was made back at a desk weeks later when an analyst cataloging the season's frames from every station on the grid ran a routine comparison pass, checking any large candid capture against every other large candid capture logged that season, station by station, the same check performed on every single survey cycle, regardless of what turns up. The software flagged a possible gate match within minutes. A biologist spent considerably longer confirming it by eye, frame by frame, before either photograph left the internal file. What the review file eventually cataloged from these 2 frames amounts to its own inventory, built the same way every flagged pair on this survey gets built. The Gray Wolf River photograph, April 30th, full body profile, right hind leg hitching mid-stride, no collar visible, coat clean and unmatted, consistent with a wild animal rather than a recently escaped captive one. The Dos Wallops photograph, May 17th. Same build, same coloring, the same right hind leg hitch, at a station with no direct sightline or trail connection to the first. The distance between the 2 stations measured along the shortest plausible travel corridor through the park's interior, 22 kilometers. The elapsed time, 17 days. Both units' internal clocks cross-checked against the grid's master log, no drift on either camera before or after. Ground disturbance at both sites, examined during the routine maintenance visit that followed each capture, consistent with a single animal passing through once, not repeated traffic or a den site nearby. The patrol and livestock report logs for both dates, checked against both stations, no loose dogs, no reported hybrid releases, nothing on record that would explain either capture independently. And frame pairs like this one, two separate stations on a long-running survey producing matched evidence weeks apart, surface out of programs like this more often than most people watching this would expect. Subscribing with notifications on is the only way to know when the next matched pair from this archive gets reviewed and released. Now, back to that trail above the Gray Wolf River. No search followed either capture because nothing here was reported missing. What followed was a wider check of every other station on the grid for large canid activity across the same 6-week window. 4 additional stations, spread across the park's northern half, logged nothing resembling either frame, no partial match, no similar gait, nothing large enough to warrant a second look. Whatever made that 22-kilometer trip left evidence at exactly 2 points, on 2 dates 17 days apart, and nowhere else the survey happened to be watching. Washington's own wildlife agency states its position on wolves in this part of the state plainly and without dismissing the people bringing it evidence. The agency maintains a public wolf observation portal specifically because staff cannot investigate every report that comes in, and it says so directly on the portal itself. Reports on that map are, in its own words, unconfirmed and do not constitute proof of wolf activity. No pack has been confirmed on the Olympic Peninsula. No territory has been mapped here. The agency's own monthly wolf reports, still being published as of this year, track confirmed packs and breeding pairs elsewhere in the state, mostly east of the Cascades where recovery began, and record nothing yet for this range specifically. A pack, under the agency's own definition, requires at least 2 wolves traveling together through a winter. A breeding pair requires 2 pups surviving to the end of the year. Neither threshold has been met here, on paper, because on paper nothing here exists yet to be measured against those numbers. That caution accounts for why this pair of photographs hasn't been announced as a rediscovery. It does not account for the photographs themselves. An unconfirmed sightings map is built for exactly this kind of case, a single credible report waiting on a second one to matter. This is the second one. One point about this file requires complete transparency, stated exactly where it belongs and not saved for the end. The agency's own reporting portal already lists other, unrelated wolf sightings submitted from elsewhere on the peninsula in recent years. Never investigated in detail, never confirmed, never denied, sitting on the same public map as hundreds of similar reports from around the state. Whether any of those earlier reports involved the same individual animal these 2 cameras caught is not something this file can establish, and no one associated with this survey has claimed that it can. That connection has never been officially confirmed anywhere, and it deserves to be weighed exactly that way. None of that uncertainty is unusual for this particular field. Wildlife agencies across the country field far more uncorroborated large canid reports than they can chase down, and the overwhelming majority resolve, when checked, into coyotes, large domestic dogs, or occasionally a genuine hybrid with no wild ancestry at all. That base rate is precisely why a single photograph rarely moves an agency's official position, and precisely why 2 photographs, matched on an injury specific enough to rule out coincidence, are treated differently by the people running this survey than either one would be alone. Attached to almost any other stretch of the Pacific Northwest, 2 trail camera photographs of a limping canid wouldn't survive a single afternoon of scrutiny. But this peninsula already carried a documented history into the review. In 1920, the last two confirmed wolves on this range were killed near the Quinault River. In 1929, the last of 46 recorded county bounty payments for the species closed out a persecution campaign that had run for over 2 decades. In 2008, the first wild wolf pups, born in Washington in nearly a century, were documented on trail cameras elsewhere in the state, proof that the species was already working its way back into ground it had been driven off of, one dispersing animal at a time. A species that keeps returning to the exact edges of where it was pushed out, on a documented rhythm spanning more than a century, stops looking like a series of isolated reports. It starts looking like a slow, specific homecoming that simply hasn't finished yet. That pattern is not confined to history. Washington's Wildlife Agency was already on record, before this pair of photographs existed, saying it expected wolves to reach the western part of the state, Olympic Peninsula included, at some point in the near future. These two frames are not a historical footnote sitting at the end of the statement. They may be the leading edge of exactly the pattern the agency already said it was watching for. Lone wolves reestablishing ground their species lost generations earlier are not unique to this peninsula. In 2011, a young male wolf known to biologists as OR7 left his birth pack in northeastern Oregon and walked alone into California, becoming the first confirmed wild wolf in that state since 1924, 87 years after the last one. He was collared, so his route was tracked in detail, thousands of kilometers, much of it through country, with no resident wolf population to receive him, until he eventually settled and bred. Nothing about the ground he crossed made his arrival less real, and nothing about it was announced in advance. The first anyone outside the research team knew of it was after the fact, from the data his collar had already logged. Nothing that follows is established as fact. It is the only account these two photographs and the record around them actually support, and no more than that. One reading of the file places it like this: a single animal dispersing alone the way young wolves elsewhere have been documented to disperse, working south along the interior drainages of the park through terrain. Few people cross on foot, injured early enough in the trip that the same hitch shows up in both frames, moving mostly at night. Staying off the maintained trails where a ranger or a hiker might see it directly. It crosses 2 camera stations by chance, not by habit, and is not caught by either camera again. The physical record doesn't move once the alternate theories are set aside. 2 frames 22 kilometers and 17 days apart. The same animal, the same injury, no collar, no hybrid markers, no unexplained gap in either station's maintenance log. Nothing in the patrol or livestock records that accounts for either capture on its own. None of it has been reconciled with a confirmed pack, a confirmed territory, or an official position beyond continued monitoring. This channel does not declare a wolf pack has returned to the Olympic Peninsula, and it will not pretend the state has either. 2 matched photographs and a documented history are not the same thing as a confirmed territory. What the record shows is what the record shows, and where the record stops, this account stops with it. Files like this one, an old range with an old name showing new evidence nobody on staff can fully explain, surface out of long-running survey grids more often than most people expect, and most of them start exactly the way this one did, as routine data, flagged by someone checking one frame against another instead of moving on. If you know of a case that belongs in this archive, the comments are usually where it starts. The camera is back on its post above the Gray Wolf River, running on the same 6-week rotation it always has. The next scheduled pull is in June. The frame ends. The river it's named for is still waiting to see if the name was early or just patient.